Hello, I'm Cambria, your host of the AdVocation Nation podcast, a podcast dedicated to highlighting different advocacy stories and journeys from many walks of life. I decided to start this podcast with the goal of educating people about the many different forms that advocacy can take on by interviewing outstanding advocates in various professional, personal, and volunteer roles. Each of these guests have great wisdom to share about what it means to be an advocate and ways that you, the listener, can advocate and support ongoing efforts in your own life.
Episodes come out every Wednesday, and you can subscribe and follow on YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify to stay tuned for more updates. We're so glad to have you here listening.
Today, I have the honor of speaking with Mike and Mandy Hoggatt. Mike and Mandy have dedicated their lives to advocacy for disability and education. Mike holds masters in both special education and public policy, as well as a Ph.D. in higher education policy with an emphasis in disability policy. He currently serves as a professor at Saddleback College in Mission Viejo, where he works alongside college students with disabilities. Mike's work on disability policy, as well as the intersection of faith and disabilities, has been published in various outlets, including the Journal of the Christian Institute on Disability, the Community College Review, the Community College Journal of Research and Practice, PRISM Magazine, and Focus on the Family. Mike regularly consults and provides training to families, disability ministries, faith communities, and related nonprofit organizations. Mandy Hoggatt earned her master's degree in clinical psychology from Vanguard University. She spent the early part of her career working with at-risk youth in Orange and LA counties. Mandy is currently an associate professor at Saddleback College, where she teaches courses as part of an independent living skills program for adults with disabilities. Additionally, Mandy serves as an advocate for her 3 children, 2 of whom have been diagnosed with autism and/or intellectual disabilities. Welcome to the show, both of you. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Cambria.
Yeah. So to start us off, could you both just tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and what led you both into your advocacy journeys?
Okay, I'll start. I think for me, I had no intention of doing any kind of advocacy, being in special education, disability service, or anything like that. I went to college to either be a journalist or a history professor, and I ended up on a short-term mission trip alongside students with disabilities. I came back from that, had the opportunity to move into a 6-bed group home, and one thing led to another, and I saw a need. I found kind of where I fit, and 25 years later, I'm still largely doing the same thing. It's where I felt called to be, where I felt my gifts and talents could be best used. And I learned a lot as I went along, and I didn't know what opportunities there were or what the needs were until I got deeper and deeper into the field. So that's my story.
Yeah, that's great. Mandy, how about you?
I think my advocacy journey had to do a lot with Michael's background in education and where he ended up, and also our adoption process and everything like that with our daughter who has autism. She's now in high school, and then having to navigate all of the avenues for her, I think, is where mine began. It just, as a parent of a child with a disability, you have to learn that pretty quickly on how to navigate and advocate for her needs. So in terms of my education and background, it wasn't something that I had intended. It was just sort of a byproduct.
Yeah, that's great. And it's great to hear how both of your lives kind of came together and were able to work together on this mission and become advocates. And I think another interesting part about both of your stories is that it was kind of figuring out where your passions were and following where you were called, which is such an important part of just listening to the needs around you and what you're hearing going on in your community. So that's great. My next question is actually for Mike. I know you studied public policy, and so I'm wondering, kind of in line with disability policy, what are some things that people could be keeping their eyes out, supporting? What are some issues that you know of and that you think listeners could find beneficial to kind of follow or keep track of?
There's a number of issues that always present themselves. So during the early stages of COVID, it was the rationing of medical care. and certain people with certain disabilities were not granted access to the same level of medical care as others, because there's this triage that happened in some countries, but also even in the United States, as far as the worthy ill versus the unworthy. And so there's always that when it comes to anytime rationing of medical care comes up, people with disabilities are going to suffer disproportionately. And we know this as we look at COVID. The mortality rates for people with developmental disabilities, the contract infection rates for people with developmental disabilities are significantly higher than the general population. So that's something to always look at, is these disproportionate outcomes. When it comes to, say, disability services, looking at things are supported. So the ability for adults with intellectual disabilities, regardless of the quote unquote severity of the disability, to make plans for their own life, to live a purposeful life, to seek employment rather than to seek being taken care of, but to actually have the opportunity to live a life with purpose, which is often denied because people with disabilities are more likely to live in a place not of their choosing. They're less likely to have meaningful employment. They're less likely to have meaningful friendships. And so employment policies, minimum wage related policies, healthcare policies, all impact the disability community in very profound ways. And so wherever you fall on the left-right spectrum in the United States, and whatever your interest happens to be, there's something that's going to intersect with disability, whether it's access or care.
That's really interesting to just think about too, how even with COVID or things that we kind of think of as public health concerns, they're especially hitting hard for folks with disabilities. And even then, also disabilities cover such a wide range of people with different backgrounds and needs. And so just thinking about ways that general policies can impact different groups within that spectrum, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and in general, any kind of aging policy, because as our bodies get older, we encounter physiological differences that lead to the potential for disability. And so policies that impact older adults, end of life policies, euthanasia, beginning of a life policies, right to life issues, all tend to impact people with disabilities differently than they do, they say, the general population, or at least people with physiological differences. It impacts them differently. When you look at American Disabilities Act requirements or waivers, and you look around and look and say, hey, if I needed wheelchair access, would I be able to get in here? Or would I be able to do this one thing that everyone else is doing? For someone who's grown up in the church, there's not a church pulpit I've ever seen that was wheelchair accessible. So there's those type of issues that continue to impact. So no matter where you are in life or whatever your passion is, disability related issues are going to be impactful.
Yeah, I think this is also just a great reminder that if you see something that you're like, hey, this might be wrong. Why is there not accessibility here for wheelchairs? Or why is there not a ramp, to say something? And just, I'm sure you wouldn't be the first person saying something, but to say something. And then also when you're looking at public health crises or other issues going on, to kind of just interrogate it from different lenses and look at the ways that it's impacting different groups. Because that's really interesting. I'd never thought about that with COVID. And now that you bring it up, I'm like, oh, of course, that makes complete and total sense with just the way that public policy is. So that's really interesting. And that actually leads into my next question for the both of you, as we're just talking about ways to make spaces more welcoming and inclusive for all different folks. What roles would you say that advocacy plays in inclusion, and what steps can people take to foster welcoming spaces for folks with many different backgrounds? I think definitely advocacy has a part in there, but how would you say that people can advocate for more inclusive spaces or help to create more inclusive spaces?
There's a number of things. And I think advocacy plays a role because my experience is that people by their nature are not inclusive. Kids are. And so kids don't need advocacy to be friends with other kids in the playground. But adults need advocacy so that they move from what's comfortable. And what's comfortable is generally the people who look like me, the people who act like me, the people who think like me is who I'm comfortable around. And so if you're going to be inclusive, that by definition means you're going to include people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who don't act like you. And so people need to be pushed a little bit. And so there needs to be advocacy on both ends. And for a sense of belonging, a community, I think there's some real simple things that communities can take to foster a sense of belonging. And they're real easy things. And it's everything from just letting people know that they're wanted, letting people know that they're missed when they're not around, making sure everyone in the community feels a sense of purpose and that people feel loved. So those are the things that when I talk to communities is what I tend to promote when it comes to inclusivity or belonging and trying to get communities to foster a sense of belonging, to develop a sense of belonging, which is difficult in an online space, as this last year has shown. It's difficult in a physical space. It's difficult because we just naturally gravitate to the people who are like us. And it takes something else. And it doesn't have to be aggressive advocacy, but it takes someone kind of walking across the room, grabbing someone's hand and introducing them to somebody else, that type of advocacy, kind of relational advocacy to make those bridges.
Yeah, for sure. And that's really great to just kind of chew on and think about, that anyone could really be an advocate in this space. It's not necessarily meaning you need to step up and, raise your voice and be super loud about it, but even just helping educate those around you and being more aware of your own blind spots and ways that you might instinctively not be inclusive towards others. Mandy, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that as well.
So Mike is an expert at the belonging and inclusion, and I think he said it best as just welcoming to people. And I think the one thing that I was just thinking is when it comes to people with disability, I'm thinking of my daughter, is to talk about her disability in a positive light. And so people aren't afraid and people aren't intimidated or concerned about who she is because it can be unpredictable at times. Her identity is, I think, is what's most important. She loves so many different things, and in that she embraces all kinds of people, and she is loving of everyone. For example, she loves art and she loves cultures and she loves movies and all of those things she's an expert at. So it's funny because she brings people together just in who she is. And so I think embracing her identity and talking about who she is, how it enriches other people's lives, I think is valuable. And I think all people with disabilities have something to offer. And if we see it and share it, I think it's valuable.
Yeah, definitely. I love just you talking about how she is such like an embodiment of just love. And it's funny because I know Mike was talking about these biases that we kind of naturally have as adults, or, even just in our culture and society, and just thinking about how much simpler it'd be if we could just kind of take down those blinders and go back to like the basic childlike just love and kindness for everything. And so it's really interesting that there's so much learning to be done, and being an advocate in this field also means educating yourself and consistently and constantly being aware of what might be holding you back and why spaces around you might not be inclusive and how you can play a role in that. And so my next question for you is just, how have both of your roles in the educational field helped you become better advocates? What skills have you learned from that, and how have you been able to translate that into different areas of your life?
Being in education, having to learn from my students is important, and being able to learn from my students, because the temptation is that just like I may be upset that everyone is isolating in silos and so I have to advocate, then all of a sudden I find that I'm in a silo of advocates. And so as I keep working and learning more about who I am and my shortcomings, but also learning from my students, and my students, similar to Mandy's, are all young adults to older adults labeled with certain types of disabilities. So learning from them and learning that there's an opportunity for me to be accepted by them. So it's real easy for someone in power, like a professor, to accept students, and that's kind of the direction we think, but to be vulnerable enough to let my students know that I appreciate that they're accepting of me. And that's something that I get in the educational environment, where I'm constantly meeting new students. Every semester is a different batch of students, or at least every year, and taking the opportunity to learn from them, growing professionally in other ways, but also growing from my students, helps me be a better version of myself, but also helps me in the other areas of my life.
Yeah, that's great. And then Mandy, I know you're also in the educational field. How has that played a role for you as well?
Well, like Mike said, I do teach adults with disabilities, and they teach me a lot of different things. But I think that when I'm in that role, I always consider my kids, like what they are going to have to deal with when they get older. And so I think on, how will this benefit our oldest when she gets to college, and what can we do to make this a better program and more welcoming to students like her. And they do enrich my life, and just recognizing that they have a lot to offer.
I appreciate from both of your responses just the component of really being receptive to those around you and the listening component and learning and realizing that you're not just there giving and teaching, but you're also being taught in so many different ways. And so I definitely kind of use this word advocacy on this show as kind of this bigger blanket term for so many different things. But I think a really big component of it is definitely learning how to listen and walk alongside others. And so, this next question, just as we've been talking about creating more welcoming spaces, I guess, what are some tangible action items that people can do in their lives to either educate themselves about ways they can be more inclusive for folks with disabilities, ways that they can just even learn more about what's going on around them? What is something you wish other people knew or wish other people would take with them as they're, going about their day-to-day lives?
I think people just need to pay attention. We get caught up in our immediate circle. We get caught up in our phone. We get caught up in whatever. And we're just not paying attention to the people around us and what they may be going through. And we have this great tendency to either blame or to somehow distance ourselves and say, well, this isn't really my problem. It's not really my community. It's not really my need. And I think if people in their communities were to really, instead of just have surface conversations with their neighbors and really, what's going on with you? What's your felt need right now? You'd start hearing more about childcare, or, I can't find someone to watch my kid because of some of the issues that he presents, or I'm having trouble navigating, Medi-Cal, or I'm having trouble, or, my sister is having mental health issues, or, whatever the issue is. I think something else I always recommend to people, because anytime I go to a community, I do this, is I recommend anyone who has the time, especially when we're back and, restrictions are lifted, is sometime during the week, go to your local mall during lunchtime and sit in the food court. And you will see groups of people with disabilities come in, and you will notice that some people are distancing themselves from them. You will just observe and watch the way the people who even work with them distance themselves, how this group of 6 to 15 individuals are dressed, how they present, how they're eating sack lunches at the food court while the staff who have the badges are, eating Panda Express. Just pay attention. My friend Jeff likes to quote Sherlock Holmes and say, you see, but you don't observe. And I think a lot of people, if they were to observe more closely, kind of the hidden issues that are going on in their community, they would naturally want to do something about it. And then that creates an opportunity for advocates to say, hey, you want to do something about it? Well, here's an opportunity. So one of the things that is important is finding those people who are opportunity makers. I think there's people who have a desire, but they don't know how, so they retreat to safety. But finding that person who can say, hey, you keep saying you want to do something like this, let me show you an opportunity, and then connecting people with the opportunities to minister, to serve, to be of help, to be an advocate, to be a friend to their neighbor. And so I think those are all important.
For sure. Yeah. I actually used to work in a group home for adults with disabilities. And so I remember we'd go bowling every Sunday. That was like our outing that we'd do with them, and they're in wheelchairs. And it's funny to see the way the people react, because you're just with other humans, other people who have the same emotions, same feelings. And it is really interesting that you say that. Just go and sit and look around, because it is something that people kind of carry inside them in so many different spaces. And so just being more aware of ways that you can be inclusive no matter where you go. Yeah. And Mandy, I'm wondering if you have anything also along the lines of tangible action items that people can do to be more welcoming and inclusive to folks in their community.
I think when I think on that topic, I'm more consumed with my child and their involvement. So I'm thinking of school and possibly church. And so I think that some things to advocate is to kind of be the squeaky wheel, and speak up and say, this is what we need. What can you guys offer? And kind of hold them to it. And we've been through various situations where the agency, we're talking about either the school or church or something like that, has said, yes, we can do this. And they go forward with it. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And then when it doesn't work, being the squeaky wheel to say, hey, what's going on? So not being intimidated, but more speaking up and, not taking no for an answer, searching for a way to make it happen. We've been surprised in some instances and others we've been disappointed. But I think if you are trying to advocate, then being a squeaky wheel. But also, I would say not assuming that they're going to do everything that they say they're going to do and just checking in on them. How did it go today? Just kind of checking in, making sure everything is going as planned. Those were things that I was thinking in terms of those types of agencies that are there to support and help our children, is to be sure that they are getting what it is they are there to receive. And so it's tricky. I think documenting everything, being sure what people are working on. And I guess a practical tip is lately I've been documenting paperwork using a phone app. Well, I don't know if it's an app, it's an iCloud notes app. And only the iCloud Notes app does it, where you can take a picture and scan an item, and it scans it like a scanner. It's perfect. I love it because I can keep track of all of the documents I need on a weekly basis as a practical tip, but just keeping track of all those things that are going on. So I hope that helps. That's more related to school or assessments and things like that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And also, yes, the Notes app, the scan document feature, I just learned it myself and it is very helpful. So I agree. Hearing you talk about how kind of scary it can be to be the squeaky wheel, and it's hard to be that one person that constantly speaks up. And I think that's part of loving someone with a disability or being a person with a disability, is it's hard to be really vulnerable time and time again. And advocating for yourself and your loved ones is so important. But I think also hopefully listeners can listen to this and be like, okay, there are action items that I can do to kind of help take that burden off a little bit and join in on that advocacy and help others be the squeaky wheels all together. It's kind of like what Mike was talking about, how everyone's in their different silos, and then you realize you're in a silo with other advocates. And so the hope for listeners would be that they kind of take this away and realize that they can make an effort to also join in on this advocacy effort, whether it's speaking out on things that they see that are wrong, or just raising awareness and educating their friends and educating themselves about what it looks like to be inclusive. And so I guess my last question for both of you is, what does advocacy mean to you, and what are ways that people can support ongoing advocacy efforts in their own communities? What is just some advice you would give for people who want to get started, whether it's with disabilities, foster care, whatever different fields? What are some good pieces of advice for that?
I think the easiest thing anyone can do is develop a relationship with someone. Because once you care about someone, you care about what they care about. So rather than coming at it from like the social warrior standpoint, the justice warrior standpoint, I'm going to right the wrongs and I'm going to be a crusader. There's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, but it's much easier to say, there's this family that is struggling with something. There's this family that's about to lose their kid. There's this family that's dealing with, medical health issues, and I can be a friend to them. I don't need to fix their problems. I can be a friend to them and listen to them and learn from them. That is going to make me an advocate on the small level, because I'm leaning into my friendship and that relationship, and I'm building community. But then it also makes me more aware of the larger community. When I see something going on, I didn't even know what that was until, I had dinner with so-and-so and really learned about what's going on with their son. Now I'm on the lookout. So now I'm more informed. It starts with relationship. How can I be a real friend to someone experiencing disability? Or how can I be a real friend to someone navigating the foster care? How can I be a real friend to someone who's in danger of losing their child? Those things more so than anything else, because getting that story and getting your heart kind of hooked into that makes for strong advocacy and gives that desire to learn more.
I would agree with Mike. And I think in terms of our story, we are in the process of fostering to adopt. And this process has been really hard. But it's like if we had never stepped up into this role, we would never have known this little boy and his story and all the things he needs. And to be in this role to advocate for him has really been a blessing, even though it's super challenging. The issues that have come up, the delays that have happened, especially with COVID, kind of delaying the court system and everything. It's a roller coaster, but to be in this position has been really, really a blessing. And hopefully we can get through it together in terms of ending it with adoption. But if it doesn't end up that way, we've definitely learned a lot in terms of how to advocate for a little guy like this one. And I hope others can, if they can just step up and be a part of something like fostering or to adopt, or even just to foster, I think would open your eyes to what's out there and what people are dealing with.
That's one of the great things about advocacy is it's at a community level, finding ways to connect with others and educating yourself and others. And so I think from what you both said, it's so important to take that first step of really just continuing to grow deeper in relationships and really meeting people and seeing them for who they are and where they're at and figuring out ways to walk alongside them. That's really great. So to finish us off, is there a way we can support you guys with your advocacy journey with Hoggatt Consulting? What are some ways that we can support you and your family?
You can always visit us online and drop a question, hoggattconsulting.com, and we'd love to connect with anybody and share a little bit of our story, share a little bit of our journey, hear a little bit about someone else's journey as well. And I think the more we hear about each other's journeys and how we're all navigating some of these processes differently, I think we continue to support each other as we're either fostering or engaging the world of disability services, or special education, or whatever it might be. So I think the sharing of stories is always important. So we always, if someone wants to stop into hoggattconsulting.com and drop a message, we'll connect, and we'd love to have that conversation.
That's great. Thank you so much, both of you, for being on the show.
Thank you. It was fun.